"Sir, you're under arrest for painting your house the wrong color." That's exactly what this hoe Karen told the police when she called them on me for daring to paint my lake cabin. This unhinged woman actually summoned law enforcement because my chosen paint shade was slightly off from her sacred color palette. She thought bringing in the cops would shame me into selling my dream home. Fatal error on her part. I'm not just any homeowner she could push around. I know how to make problems disappear, and when I was finished, she didn't just lose control. She lost everything. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story gets crazier. This wasn't just a house to me, it was hallowed ground, a living tribute to my late mother's last wish. 3 years before cancer claimed her, she'd gently touch an old travel brochure and whisper, "Someday we'll have a little blue house by the lake, son." Blue like hope, blue like dreams fulfilled. I kept that brochure as my computer wallpaper for years, while grinding through brutal 80-hour work weeks in corporate consulting, sacrificing nearly everything to bring her vision to life. When I finally got the cabin, I knew it had to be oceanic blue, the color of my mother's eyes, the color of the sky the last day she smiled at me. I mixed the paint myself with the help of the store clerk, feeling like a kid with his first art project. That's when Margaret Walsh emerged from behind some bushes, moving with the stealth of a suburban secret agent. Mid-50s, unmistakable. "I demand to speak with your manager." Haircut, wielding a pink clipboard and a color meter like deadly weapons. "Excuse me, sir," she barked, voice dripping with self-appointed authority. "That paint is absolutely not on our approved palette." I turned, paintbrush still wet, trying to keep things friendly. "Oh, hi there. Doesn't it look beautiful by the water?" Margaret's stare stayed frosty. Her reply sliced through the morning like a razor. "Beautiful is subjective. Compliance is mandatory." What she did next could haunt anyone's dreams. She stepped up to my freshly painted wall like a CSI investigator at a crime scene, theatrically pulling out her color device. "This is clearly P325 Oceanic Blue," she pronounced, double-checking her clipboard as if she were reading a guilty verdict. "Our covenant strictly requires P322 Seafoam Green. This creates a 2.3% variance in light reflection." She paused, letting the gravity of my crime sink in. "Do you realize the chaos this could unleash on our property values?" I just stared, speechless at the absurdity. These two shades looked nearly identical to any sane person, but to Margaret, this tiny difference was as offensive as spray painting curse words across the siding. I tried to reason with her. "Honestly, they look almost the same. I can hardly tell them apart," she gasped, hand to chest as if I'd confessed to burning down a hospital. That attitude is precisely the problem. I didn't spend 8 years shaping this community's standards so you could tear them down with your rebellious paint choices. Before I could reply, she had already dialed 911, shifting from bossy neighbor to full courtroom drama. "Yes, officers. I need you at Lakeview Heights immediately. We have an active property destruction incident. The suspect refuses to comply with municipal regulations." You'd think I was cooking meth instead of painting my cabin. About 20 minutes later, 2 visibly puzzled officers pulled into my driveway, Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson. They got out, looking around as if trying to figure out why they'd been summoned to what was clearly just a peaceful neighborhood. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez began, carefully. "Dispatch said something about a broken bar, a paint color violation." Margaret instantly switched into prosecutor mode. "Officers, this individual is intentionally sabotaging our community's property values with unauthorized aesthetic choices. This violates Municipal Code 4.2.7 and creates a public nuisance. Immediate enforcement is necessary." The 2 officers shared a look that said it all. They couldn't believe they'd been dragged into a fight over paint. The humiliation wasn't just that they were here, it was what came next. Wanting to calm things down and probably eager to return to actual police work, they politely asked me to sign a violation acknowledgement. Not because I'd broken an actual law, but to get Margaret to stop flooding dispatch with calls. So there I stood, signing that paper in front of 8 curious neighbors who'd come to watch. It felt like something inside me cracked. I'd once negotiated half-billion-dollar deals, stared down corporate giants, and here I was, being shamed over paint. The same shade my dying mother had chosen from an old, faded travel ad. Margaret kept her distance during all this, arms folded, smirk fixed on her face like she'd just won the lottery. After the officers left, she strutted over, voice loud enough for anyone left to hear. "Sometimes it takes tough love and firm boundaries to keep property values safe," she declared, as if she were delivering a victory speech. Then came the final blow, a $3,000 fine, hand-delivered, complete with a pink sticky note in Margaret's careful handwriting. "Welcome to our community. I hope today's lesson about standards was educational. Warm regards, Margaret W." She'd even drawn a cheerful smiley face at the bottom, like this was a friendly gift basket instead of extortion. But what Margaret didn't realize was she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, because you should never try to humiliate someone who buys and sells companies for a living. The only question that remained was, how far was I willing to go to reclaim my mother's dream? Drop a comment below. What's the pettiest thing an HOA has ever done to you? The violation notice that landed on my doorstep the next morning was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. 5 pages of single-spaced legal jargon that read like an indictment for crimes against humanity, except my supposed offense was painting my cabin the wrong blue. Margaret had catalogued my supposed infractions with obsessive detail. Oceanic blue paint reflects 2.3% more sunlight than approved seafoam green, posing a potential glare hazard for passing vehicles. Another gem, unauthorized color deviation breaches aesthetic harmony covenant. Section 12.4.7, subsection C, the punishment, a daily fine of $100 until the paint was corrected, plus a $500 community impact fee, and the kicker, the cost of repainting through their approved contractor was estimated at $4,200. Margaret had thoughtfully done the math for me at the bottom: pay all fines, hire their vendor, and my mistake would cost me nearly $8,000. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with draining my bank account. She escalated her attack to a social media blitz aimed at turning the whole neighborhood against me. She posted professional-looking photos of my cabin from every possible angle, paired with captions that framed me as a reckless threat to community standards. New member receiving essential education about preserving neighborhood harmony. Sometimes gentle correction is needed to protect everyone's investment. Grateful for neighbors who care about excellence. Dozens of likes rolled in. People I hadn't even met were chiming in about how newcomers needed to respect community values. Reading those comments felt like watching my neighbors publicly vote me off the island before I'd even had the chance to say hello. The first week of Margaret's campaign felt like psychological warfare carefully engineered by someone with a degree in harassment. Every morning, sharp at 7 a.m., she'd appear at my property line with a ruler in hand, measuring my grass as though calculating rocket trajectories. 2.7 inches detected, she'd announce loudly, consulting her clipboard with mock serious formality. Covenant specifies a 2.5-inch maximum. Violation notice forthcoming. An orange traffic cone then mysteriously appeared in my driveway, taped with a citation for unauthorized guest parking in a designated fire safety zone, even though I hadn't hosted a single guest and the cone had obviously been planted there by Margaret herself. One Saturday morning, I dared to mow my lawn at 10:30 a.m. Margaret promptly filed a noise complaint, citing newly revised quiet hours that allegedly extended until 11 a.m., per Community Guideline Section 8.2. By the second week, she had escalated to tactics that could impress professional interrogators. My mail suddenly stopped coming. Margaret had reported my mailbox was positioned 3.2 inches too close to the street, violating updated municipal setback requirements. Then came a formal letter claiming my garden hose, innocently coiled beside the house, disrupted landscape aesthetics. My bird feeder, labeled an unauthorized wildlife station, likely to attract vermin and thus banned under pest control ordinances. Every morning, there was a fresh violation notice waiting for me, each one more absurd than the last, each with its own fine and compliance deadline. By week 3, Margaret had turned the whole thing into a dystopian surveillance project. 4 times a day, she'd patrol past my property armed with her clipboard and camera, documenting every fallen leaf, every uneven blind slat, every harmless shadow cast at the wrong angle. She even produced high-resolution photos of laughable offenses: a single autumn leaf on my walkway, My car parked 6 inches closer to the curb than optimal, window blinds not perfectly aligned. Then she moved to recruit allies. Margaret began knocking on every door in the neighborhood, distributing glossy flyers warning that merely associating with community troublemakers could tarnish property values and urging everyone to uphold unity and standards at all costs. The psychological impact was devastating. Neighbors who had once waved politely now crossed the street to avoid me. Quick trips to the grocery store became awkward affairs, as strangers I'd never spoken to suddenly knew I was that guy. At the community pool, families would gather up their towels and children the moment I arrived, as if I were carrying some contagious disease. Even kids were being called inside when I walked past, their parents peering through curtains like I was some kind of wanted criminal. But not everyone had bought into Margaret's campaign of fear. One evening, Tom and Linda Rodriguez knocked on my door. Tom, a retired teacher, and Linda, a former nurse, looked genuinely worried. "We've been watching Margaret destroy this neighborhood bit by bit for years," Tom said, his voice heavy with sadness. "She's already chased away 6 good families, people who just wanted to live quietly." Linda nodded. "She's not protecting property values, as she's terrorizing neighbors into submission. Someone with courage has to finally stop her before there's nothing left to save." I tried to protest that I was just a single person, honoring a promise to my mother, but Tom's response hit me harder than any fine. "Sometimes one person, driven by the right reason, can change everything." And then everything shifted the night Henry Kim showed up at my door. He was jittery, glancing over his shoulder like he feared being caught. Henry, 68, had once been the HOA's treasurer, and he held a manila folder to his chest as if it contained state secrets. "What I'm about to show you could end her reign," he whispered, voice shaking. "But if she finds out this came from me, it'll ruin me." Inside the folder, proof of financial fraud so blatant it made my paint color violation look like forgetting to return a library book. Bank records that exposed systematic theft and abuse of power. The records inside Henry's folder were damning. Payments totaling $47,000 for landscape enhancement services, yet the neighborhood hadn't seen a single new flower or shrub. Another $23,000 supposedly spent on security and safety consulting, despite 0 upgrades and no cameras, no patrols, nothing. Then there was $31,000 earmarked for community aesthetic improvements, even though the place looked exactly as it had 4 years ago. Every payment, without exception, funneled straight into MW Enterprises, like Margaret's own business. Henry's hands trembled as he flipped through spreadsheets, bank statements, fake invoices, and emails that together revealed 4 years of systematic embezzlement totaling over $100,000. "She's been stealing from us for years," Henry confessed, voice shaking. "But I'm 68 and terrified. She'll ruin me like she's ruined everyone else who dared challenge her." As I read through the evidence, something crystallized in my mind. Margaret wasn't just an obsessive HOA enforcer with a ruler and a clipboard. She was a white-collar predator running a long con under the banner of community management and dismantling operations like this. That happened to be my specialty. The next morning, I made a call that would set everything in motion. "James," I told my corporate attorney, "I need you to set up a shell company, make it clean, discreet, untraceable." James Parker had handled dozens of my acquisitions over the years, but this request clearly surprised him. "What kind of acquisition are we talking about, Alex?" he asked. For the first time since Margaret's war began, I allowed myself a real smile. "The most satisfying hostile takeover of my life, James. I'm going to buy an entire homeowners association." Margaret thought I was just another hapless homeowner she could bully into submission. She had no idea she'd picked a fight with someone whose day job was dismantling corporate fortresses. But could I actually buy an HOA to stop this nightmare? Maybe you've wondered the same thing yourself. Could you just buy your way out of HOA hell? While I was laying my plans, Margaret interpreted my silence as surrender and escalated to what she clearly saw as her nuclear option. She scheduled an emergency tribunal grandly titled the Community Standards Crisis Resolution Session. The letter announcing it was draped in legal jargon, as though she were convening the Supreme Court instead of a neighborhood meeting. "Fellow property stakeholders," it began in bold print, We face an unprecedented existential threat to the integrity and value preservation systems of our community. Immediate, decisive action is required to protect our shared investments and quality of life. The meeting agenda read like something out of an authoritarian handbook: a vote to seize my cabin under eminent domain for willful covenant violations, permanent banishment from all communal facilities, a pool, dock, mailbox cluster, sidewalks, common areas, imposition of a $500 daily fine until I complied with her ever-changing standards, authorization to pursue maximum legal damages for property value diminishment and reputational harm. To enforce this new reign of terror, Margaret installed surveillance measures that would impress any police state. Security cameras were repositioned to keep my property under constant watch, creating the unsettling sense that every move I made was recorded and reviewed. She established a resident reporting system, encouraging neighbors to document anything I did: photos, written statements, timestamps, anything that could be twisted into a violation. Her daily compliance inspections turned into an absurd ritual, complete with color meters, sound meters, high-resolution cameras, and measuring tapes. The psychological pressure felt crushing, like being under house arrest, my life constantly under the microscope, waiting for any small slip to become her next weapon. And Margaret didn't stop with me. She spread her intimidation campaign to anyone who dared show kindness. She visited Tom and Linda Rodriguez under the guise of a friendly chat, but her message was unmistakable: your continued association with this community disruptor is becoming increasingly problematic for neighborhood stability and property values. Any further expressions of support may require a comprehensive review of your own compliance history. I trust you understand the implications. The subtext couldn't have been clearer: support him, and you're next. The effect tripled through the neighborhood like an electric shock. Almost overnight, fear replaced friendliness. Mrs. Williams, who had always smiled at me, received a $200 fine for her beloved wind chimes and removed them in tears. The Johnson family got hit with $300 in penalties for their kids' toys left in the yard and had to pack away everything, forcing their children indoors. The Millers paid $150 per garden gnome and finally stripped their yard bare, transforming it from charming to sterile corporate blandness. Margaret's message was brutally effective: resist me, and you will pay. Show sympathy, and I will come for you next. There would be no exceptions, no forgiveness, no appeals. The isolation became painfully real. Overnight, I went from being the newcomer everyone welcomed to the outcast they actively avoided. Neighbors who once offered small talk now crossed the street to steer clear. Quick grocery runs turned into gauntlets of suspicious looks and whispered conversations I could feel, even if I couldn't hear the words. And all of it because I chose the wrong shade of blue. Whenever I stepped into the community pool area, conversations would abruptly stop. Within minutes, the pool deck cleared out entirely despite my paying the same membership fees as everyone else. Parents hurried their children indoors when I simply walked past on my evening stroll, peering at me from behind curtains as if I were some lurking threat to the entire neighborhood. Margaret had successfully weaponized social pressure, turning ordinary neighborly caution into full-blown ostracism. My daily life became a slow-motion exile, but in her triumph, she made a fatal miscalculation that would lead to her undoing. At 11:47 p.m. on a cold Tuesday night, my phone buzzed. Henry Kim's voice came through, low and shaking. She just filed official paperwork with the county courthouse to seize your property under eminent domain. The hearing's set for Friday at 9 a.m. If you're planning to fight this, you need to act now. She's moving fast to make it permanent. That call changed everything. What had started as a petty dispute over paint color had escalated into an existential fight over my home, my mother's memory, and my basic property rights. Margaret had crossed the final line from harassment to attempted theft. She didn't know she'd picked a target who spent 15 years engineering hostile corporate takeovers for a living. The second I hung up, it was like flipping a switch. The instincts honed over years dismantling underperforming companies roared to life. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to take over the entire HOA. I analyzed our HOA like any takeover target. There were 23 properties, which translated to 23 voting shares. Under the bylaws, 12 votes would secure board control, a simple majority. and I already knew several owners were desperate to escape Margaret's tyranny. My acquisition plan was deceptively simple in concept, but complex in execution. Quietly buy up voting rights through an untraceable shell company, secure controlling interest, and force a full-scale corporate restructuring from within before Margaret even suspected what was happening. James Parker worked through the night, expediting paperwork to create Lakeview Holdings LLC. As he prepared the legal scaffolding, I sketched out my strategy with the same precision I once used in Manhattan boardrooms. We're not just buying votes, James. We're buying justice backed by corporate law and executed like a hostile takeover. The legal path was surprisingly clean. HOA voting rights could be bought, transferred, and consolidated, just like corporate shares and LLC ownership didn't have to be disclosed to the existing board. Margaret's iron-fisted rule had created perfect conditions for a stealth acquisition. To pull it off, I needed every skill in my toolkit: strategic intelligence, negotiation, and psychological insight. What looked like friendly chats on porches or over coffee were in reality targeted reconnaissance missions to identify who was ready to sell, why, and at what price. Mrs. Williams, exhausted at 74 from endless fines, didn't hesitate. "You want to buy my HOA votes so I never have to hear from that woman again? Take them, forever." 2 votes, $5,000 each. Done. The Johnson family, already packing to move out of state because of Margaret's cruelty, practically begged me to take their 3 votes for $8,000 total. "This is a spite sale. We'd love to help you burn her little empire to the ground." The Millers, still furious about the $450 fine that forced them to strip their yard of every gnome, sold their 2 votes for $6,008, clearly savoring the thought of revenge. "If you're taking her down, count us in." 4 absentee landlords, tired of constant compliance headaches, handed over their votes at $2,000 each. "No questions asked, just get us out of this nightmare, and the votes are yours." Every deal was formally documented, notarized, and recorded with the county clerk. A completely legal, completely final. Each purchase flowed through Lakeview Holdings LLC, keeping my identity hidden. Week by week, the numbers climbed. Week 1. My own property, plus Tom and Linda Rodriguez and Mrs. Williams, totaling 5 votes. Week 2, the Johnsons, bringing me to 8 votes. Week 3, the Millers and the first absentee landlord, pushing us to 11 votes, just one shy of majority. Week 4, the remaining 3 absentee landlords closed the deal, giving me 13 out of 23 votes, an ironclad 56.5% controlling majority. All the while, Margaret had no idea her power was evaporating. Ironically, as my silent takeover unfolded, she doubled down on public displays of authority. In retrospect, her arrogance was almost comedic. Convinced of her absolute power, she organized what she dramatically titled a Community Standards Restoration Victory Ceremony, complete with printed invitations dropped in every mailbox. Join us this Friday at 7 p.m. as we celebrate the preservation of our neighborhood's integrity. A broken bar. She genuinely believed she'd cornered me, poised to crush all dissent forever. She had no idea that, by then, I already owned her kingdom. Margaret's invitation dripped with smug triumph. "We officially restore proper order and establish standards to Lakeview Heights. Witness the power of united neighborhood action against aesthetic disruption and willful covenant violation. Light refreshments and celebratory desserts will follow the legal proceedings." She was so certain of victory that she'd planned an actual party complete with catered sweets and speeches to mark my property's seizure and my public banishment. When my RSVP landed on her desk, I wouldn't miss this historic evening for anything in the world. Margaret likely took it as a sign of graceful surrender. In her mind, I was finally bowing before her authority. She had no idea she'd handed me the perfect stage for the most personally satisfying corporate takeover of my life. Her victory party was about to become her public reckoning. In James Parker's law office the night before, our final prep session felt less like legal review and more like planning a special operations raid. Every scenario had been mapped, every response rehearsed until it felt like muscle memory. By Friday evening, Margaret believed she was at the height of her power. I arrived at the community center carrying a slim leather portfolio, the kind I'd carried into Manhattan boardrooms 100 times. Inside lay the documents that would quietly but absolutely dismantle Margaret's reign. Margaret had transformed the hall into her private courtroom theater. She'd positioned herself at the head table like a judge about to pronounce sentence, with a real wooden gavel and a brass nameplate reading HOA President Margaret Walsh. Folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows, an American flag stood solemnly behind her, and the entire setup dripped with self-appointed authority. She'd even addressed the part, navy blazer buttoned tie like judicial robes, posture stiff with rehearsed solemnity. Then came the performance. Margaret cleared her throat and began reading from a thick stack of printed charges, 47 in total, with the overblown drama of a federal prosecutor arguing before the Supreme Court. Alexander Miller stands formally accused of systematic violation of community covenant standards, including but not limited to, unauthorized paint color, excessive grass height, noise ordinance infractions, parking violations, landscape negligence, and willful defiance of lawful HOA authority. She paused theatrically between each charge, scanning the audience as if daring anyone to disagree. Then, with the final flourish only a true petty tyrant could summon, she announced, based on documented photographic evidence, multiple resident testimonies, and irrefutable covenant violations, I hereby move to seize this violator's property under Section 15.3a and ban him permanently from Lakeview Heights. The room collectively inhaled. Even those who'd quietly supported Margaret seemed startled by the scale of her sentence. Many had expected fines, maybe forced repainting and not complete confiscation and exile. In her obsession with crushing me completely, Margaret had crossed a line, turning neighborhood governance into open theft. And for the first time, her audience saw it. As uneasy murmurs spread across the room, Margaret, oblivious, called for my response. I rose slowly, deliberately, hands clasped behind my back, at the same posture I'd used in dozens of high-stakes negotiations. My heart pounded, but my voice was calm, controlled. "Margaret," I began evenly, "you've assembled impressively thorough documentation, truly remarkable attention to detail." Her lips curled into a victorious smirk. In her mind, I was conceding defeat. "So, you're finally accepting the reality of your situation?" she asked, barely containing her glee. I allowed myself the faintest smile, the kind of smile I'd worn just before revealing a hidden asset that would flip an entire deal. "Oh, I see the picture with perfect clarity now, Margaret." I reached under my chair, pulled out my leather portfolio, and placed it gently on the table. "In fact," I continued, "I have some documentation of my own I'd like to share. Financial records, specifically." Margaret waved dismissively, visibly irritated that I dared interrupt her victory speech. "Your personal finances are completely irrelevant to these proceedings," she snapped, voice sharp with authority. Her loyalists nodded along, still convinced this was a legitimate trial rather than the sham it truly was. They had no idea that within the next minute, their entire power structure was about to collapse publicly, irrevocably, and in full view of the very neighbors Margaret had spent years trying to impress. I opened the portfolio slowly, deliberately, like uncorking a vintage wine I'd waited years to savor. "These aren't my finances, Margaret," I said, my tone calm and almost casual. "They're yours." The room seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. One by one, I held up large copies of the evidence Henry had risked everything to gather. MW Enterprises LLC, A Landscape Enhancement Services, $47,000. MW Enterprises LLC, A Landscape Security Safety Consulting, $23,000. Then, the real bombshell, bank routing documents tracing those funds directly from the HOA's community account to Margaret's private business checking account. Gasps ripped through the room. Metal chairs screeched across linoleum as neighbors leaned forward, straining to see the details. Whispers crackled like static. It was the exact reaction I'd planned for. Margaret's face twitched, a confusion giving way to shock, then fear, then a red-faced rage that made her hands tremble. "Those payments represent completely legitimate community improvement expenses," she shouted, her polished courtroom composure cracking under the weight of panic. "You have absolutely no authority to question properly approved HOA financial decisions." I nodded, as though weighing her words carefully, still wearing the calm, unshakable expression I'd perfected in countless boardrooms. "You're right, Margaret. Under the previous governance, no one had the authority to question your financial practices." I let the silence stretch, the tension tightening around the room like a wire. However, a broken bar, I paused, lowering my voice for maximum impact. "I do now, as the new controlling stakeholder of this homeowners association." Right on cue, I signaled to James Parker. He stepped forward and began distributing legal documents to every resident like a dealer at a high-stakes poker table. Papers rustled, heads bent, eyes widened as neighbors skimmed unfamiliar corporate language. I stepped closer and spoke clearly so every person in that hall could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to formally introduce myself, Alexander Miller. And as of this week, I have acquired majority controlling ownership of the Lakeview Heights Homeowners Association through legitimate corporate acquisition processes." A silence heavier than concrete settled over the room. For 15 breathless seconds, nothing but the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the low whir of the air conditioning. Margaret's expression crumbled in real time, Mia confidence dissolving into disbelief, then horror. "That's absolutely impossible," she finally croaked, voice cracking. "I am this homeowners association. You can't just purchase neighborhood like a corporate asset." I kept my voice level, almost gently, like explaining hard truths to a failing CEO. "Past tense, Margaret, you controlled this community. Present tense, I control it now through majority ownership." I gestured toward the documents James had distributed. "A certificate of controlling ownership under Lakeview Holdings LLC, a voting rights transfer agreements from 13 of 23 property owners, a new board composition naming me as chairman and president, a automatic dissolution of the previous board structure upon acquisition." For a beat, the room hung silent, then the dam burst. Tom and Linda Rodriguez leapt up, tears streaming, applauding with raw relief. Mrs. Williams raised her hands skyward, shouting, "Thank God Almighty!" Finally, someone with backbone to stand up to this tyrant. Even the Johnson kids were cheering like they just watched a walk-off home run in the World Series. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years found their voices, applause swelling until it shook the windows. 8 years of quiet resentment unleashed in a single, roaring moment. Margaret's meltdown unfolded before every Nia textbook psychological collapse in stages. First, denial. "This is corporate terrorism, completely illegal under state and federal law. You can't just buy an entire neighborhood." Then, rage. She stood, pointing a trembling finger at me, voice shaking with fury. "You think you can buy your way out of consequences? These people trusted me to protect their property values." I stayed calm. "They trusted you with over $100,000 in community funds, which you systematically funneled into your own accounts." Her face paled. "Next, desperate bargaining. I'll make restitution every penny, plus interest. We can negotiate a settlement that keeps this quiet." My voice stayed cold, final. The window for negotiation closed the moment you tried to steal my family's home. And then came the last stage, a complete psychological collapse as she realized, fully, that her reign was over. Margaret's collapse was almost theatrical. She slumped into her chair like a marionette with its strings cut, mascara running in black rivulets down her cheeks. "This entire community was my whole life, a broken bar my sole purpose, a broken bar my legacy," she whispered, voice breaking under the weight of her own downfall. But she wasn't done yet. Stage 5 arrived as a final, furious outburst. She sprang to her feet and screamed, voice echoing off the community center walls, "You'll destroy everything. This neighborhood will collapse into chaos within 6 months without proper leadership and standards." Her voice cracked, rage giving way to raw humiliation. The entire room watched in heavy silence as the woman who had ruled them for years unraveled before their eyes. Once her meltdown was complete, I stepped forward, my tone as calm and measured as if I were delivering a quarterly report. "As your new HOA president, I'm announcing immediate policy reforms effective tonight." I outlined the changes in clear, deliberate language. All fines and penalties from the past 12 months, canceled and refunded within 30 days. The color palette, expand. Their residents could now choose what brought them joy. Grass height and landscape micromanagement abolished. Noise ordinances rewritten to balance personal freedom and community peace. Margaret Walsh terminated from all HOA roles, effective immediately, and within 30 days. Democratic elections where every resident would have an equal voice. When I called for a vote, the response was unanimous, 12 votes in favor, 0 opposed. Margaret had already stormed out mid-speech, slamming the door so hard that a framed photo of the community's founding fell and shattered on the tile. She drove off into the night, her 8-year reign reduced to broken glass and silence. But I wasn't finished, because stealing $100,000 from your neighbors shouldn't end with just losing your power. The next morning, I walked into the district attorney's office, carrying an evidence file thick enough to make any prosecutor's pulse quicken. "We have documented proof of systematic embezzlement," I explained to Assistant DA Rebecca Martinez, totaling $111,000 over 4 consecutive years plus attempted property theft. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged invoices, bank statements, email trails, and Henry Kim's testimony. Within 48 hours, formal charges were filed against Margaret Walsh: grand larceny, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Civil lawsuits demanded full restitution plus damages and legal fees. Property liens were placed on her home, her bank accounts were frozen, her real estate license suspended pending investigation. And then the story hit the news, spreading like wildfire. HOA president accused of massive embezzlement scheme led 3 local channels, complete with Margaret's mugshot broadcast across the county. Footage of deputies arriving at her door handcuffing her as stunned neighbors watch. Ida became the year's most viewed local news segment. Reporters shouted questions she tried to hide from, shielding her face with shaking hands. Her professional reputation disintegrated overnight. Her accounts were deactivated or flooded with angry comments. Her part-time real estate job terminated. Week 2 brought total financial ruin. Legal fees stacked up at $15,000 a week. With accounts frozen and no cash flow, Margaret was forced to put her house into foreclosure. The court ordered full restitution of the stolen $111,000 plus 20% penalty interest, $121,200 she simply didn't have. Desperate, she held a garage sale that drew curious neighbors. People who once feared her now watched her sell jewelry, furniture, and keepsakes for pennies on the dollar. The woman who had fined neighbors over grass length now stood in her driveway bargaining over the price of a lamp to pay for a lawyer. And socially, she was obliterated. Former allies wouldn't return her calls. Trips to the grocery store became humiliating gauntlets of stares and whispered gossip. Her country club membership was revoked. Her adult children distanced themselves. Family gatherings were quietly cancelled. Grandchildren's classmates asked awkward questions about why grandma was on the news in handcuffs. Margaret became a ghost in her own home. Curtains drawn, lights dim, too ashamed to face the people she once bullied. Meanwhile, the neighborhood she'd claimed would collapse without her was thriving. Our new Democratic HOA, with me as interim president, Henry Kim as treasurer overseeing transparent finances, Linda Rodriguez managing community engagement, and Tom Rodriguez focusing on problem solving, rolled out reforms that actually brought neighbors together. We published every transaction online each month, every expense, every decision, out in the open. Decision-making now required community-wide voting on major issues, and we made reasonable accommodations for individual family preferences. The Johnson family's new playground equipment, approved unanimously with shared funding. Mrs. Williams's wind chimes, celebrated as cultural enrichment that gave the neighborhood character. The Miller couple's whimsical garden gnomes, officially designated a community art installation. Then came Margaret's moving day. It was a cold Tuesday morning in late November. The moving truck rumbled up at 6 a.m. and Margaret stepped out wearing a sweatshirt and baseball cap, clinging to some last shred of dignity as she packed what was left of her life into a small U-Haul trailer. Our neighborhood gathered, but not to jeer, and not to comfort. We watched silently, not out of cruelty, but as witnesses to the natural consequence of 8 years of fear and control. As she loaded her final box, Margaret turned to me, eyes burning with defiance, and made one last attempt to justify herself. "You think this is some kind of victory?" she said. But communities need structure and standards. Without authority and enforcement, this place will fall into chaos within 6 months. My response was calm, final. Margaret, you confused fear with respect, and control with leadership. Communities thrive on cooperation and not intimidation. There's a difference between structure and tyranny. 2 weeks later, a foreclosure auction notice appeared on the lawn of Margaret's former fortress. Lakeview Holdings LLC submitted a sealed bid, $75,000, far below market value, but fitting for a property so deeply stained by scandal. At a special community meeting, residents gathered, curious about what I intended. "Are you going to flip it, rent it out? What's your plan?" they asked. I smiled, genuinely excited. "We're turning it into something this neighborhood has always needed, a space that belongs to everyone." The room buzzed with energy, and people immediately understood the beautiful irony, transforming Margaret's private seat of power into the Lakeview Community Center. What followed was nothing short of a renaissance. Month 1. Community planning sessions where neighbors shared what we truly wanted: meeting spaces, a community kitchen, activity rooms, and a playground. Month 2. Renovations and neighbors donating time, skills, and materials to turn Margaret's house from a symbol of control into a place of connection. Her once strictly guarded living room became our meeting hall. Her immaculate kitchen turned into a gathering space for potlucks. Bedrooms transformed into children's art rooms and senior reading lounges. The garage that once sheltered Margaret's car now held ping-pong and pool tables. And the backyard, once her chemically perfect lawn, blossomed into a shared garden and playground. Month 3, we held the grand opening. Every resident came. We cut the ribbon, then shared a massive potluck dinner where each family brought their favorite dish. Children raced around with face paint and treasure maps. Seniors held the first meeting of their book club in what used to be Margaret's surveillance post. Teenagers jammed on guitars in the garage. Laughter replaced whispers. Collaboration replaced suspicion. 6 months later, I sat on my porch, the sunset turning my oceanic blue walls gold. It was everything my late mother had dreamed of. In the community center yard, where Margaret's pristine lawn had once been, children played freely. Seniors read on the porch that had once been Margaret's lookout. Teenagers practiced music in the old garage. Tom and Linda tended the thriving garden. Henry Kim taught a financial literacy class in the living room where Margaret had once plotted her schemes. A new professional sign at the entrance read, Lakeview Community Center, from control to community, established 2024, and a bronze plaque below, dedicated to the principle that neighborhoods flourish through cooperation, not domination, and that, in the end, is how you defeat an HOA tyrant who tries to crush your American dream. All I ever wanted was to paint my house the oceanic blue my mother chose from an old travel brochure. Margaret Walsh thought a $3,000 fine and years of petty tyranny could stop that dream. But here's what she never understood: real communities aren't built on fear, rules, and measuring tapes. They're built on respect, kindness, and neighbors who actually care. She thought she owned the neighborhood. Turns out, we bought Ita and made it better than ever. Now, Margaret's former fortress is a place where children laugh, seniors share stories, and neighbors build real friendships instead of filing violation reports. That's what I call real transformation. If you've ever had to stand up to an HOA tyrant, smash that like button, subscribe and ring the bell for more stories where justice is served ice cold. And tell me in the comments, what color would you paint your dream home if no HOA Karen could stop you? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes, the best way to solve a problem, a broken bar, is to buy the problem, fix it, and turn it into something beautiful. Keep fighting for your dreams, and no matter what color they are.